Professor Boudon began as a practicing architect in the late 1960s, but then decided to limit his activities to research. He was awarded the Grand Prize of Architectural Criticism in 1986 and a medal for architectural analysis by the Academy of Architecture. For 6 years, he was a member of CNRS. Professor Boudon has served as a visiting professor in the PhD program at Georgia Tech, at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, and the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Among his many publications are books on l'espace architectural and an introduction to architecturologie. A monograph on Richelieu, that new town that was built in the early 17th century, and with others, a volume on the teaching of the architectural concept, a course text in architecturology. And most recently, he has directed a publication on that's entitled From Architecture to Epistemology, a question of scale. Professor Boudon will speak to us this morning about the initial conception or idea that governs or engenders the transformation into form, with his paper Kahn's Square and Kant's Square, Which Kind of Intuition in Architects' Sketches. Professor Boudon.
Okay. Okay. Could you take? One can find a great variety of sketches in architects' working documents. To start, I want to show two of them which are so different that they let us imagine an infinite series of other, still different sketches to be found between the limits which these two indicate. The first one is by Alvar Aalto. The second is by Auguste Perret. Excuse me. The first one shows a design in progress which goes through apparently complex operations. The second seems to give us, as if suddenly produced, the actual portrait of the constructed building. Confronted with this variety, my point will be to ask if there is any way to escape the contingency, the singularity of sketches, and if it is possible to find out from them an invaluable general observation for knowledge in architecture. My question is then essentially an epistemological question. Though an architectural sketch may have some value for the historian or for the critic as a secondary document or as additional information for them, what can be said of the sketch as such? How can we escape the epistemological limits, which in my view are of three types: interpretation, speculation, intuition? Interpretation is not bad in itself, but it gives the sketch this secondary role linked to the history of a given building, for example, as in the case of monography. Speculation is not bad either, but the open character of the sketch, which has probably an heuristic function for the designer, and which is part of the liberty of creation for him, becomes, in my view, an obstacle for research, by giving free leeway to uncontrolled interpretation. One could possibly think that a sketch is the place for intuition, understood as a sudden idea, which Paul Valéry resumes thus: I didn't see, and I see. But my thesis here is parallel to Karl Popper's thesis in matter of scientific discovery. If one must admit that the scientist has ideas, the way he gets ideas is not an object of scientific knowledge. In the same way, there is no doubt that an architect has ideas, but for me, I do not think that the way these ideas occur to him is a matter of knowledge. From this point of view, sketches seem to show us invention at work, but in fact, however fascinating they may be, they do not tell us a lot about that process. Finally, the best they can offer is probably that which is of interest to the historian, but again, only as a complementary document as opposed to the value of sketches as such. And my question remains, what is the minimum generality that we can point to in matter of sketches? This issue of general versus singular is precisely the so-called problem of intuition in matter of philosophy of mathematics. For intuition, which has here a different meaning from the sudden idea, which I mentioned earlier, involves the question of the relation between immediate knowledge, or rather immediate sensitivity, to general knowledge through the generality of concept, as it is the case, for example, in Kant's philosophy. For instance, Kant says that there is no image of a triangle which could be adequate to the triangle in general. To a certain extent, one would find an opposite interpretation of intuition in Descartes' philosophy. Intuition is the way through which intelligence goes from a particular given triangle to the general triangle of the geometrician. It's not my intention to give a lecture on the philosophy of mathematics here, but it does have something to do with our problems, since one can find geometrical figures in architecture, the question being to try to know what is at stake behind those figures. Let us, for instance, take the phrase of the architect Louis Kahn, who declares, I always start with a square, no matter the problem is. What kind of thing is this square he speaks about, and which we would find, if we are to believe him, in any of his sketches? Here are some squares by Kahn of different types, and drawing sketches, schemas, and so on. What kind of thing is this square he speaks about, and which we would find if we are to believe him in any of his sketches? This square is indeed a singular figure, because it is clear that other architects will not necessarily start with a square. An architect may start instead with a triangle or even with a plate of spaghetti. This is a sketch by Alvar Aalto. And once again, we face the singular nature of the sketch. But Kant's phrase interests me because the word always lets us guess that something general is involved. I always start with a square, says he. So this square is involved in the question of the opposition between singular and general, which I pointed out under the term of intuition. My thesis is that some general function is at work behind this square, and furthermore, that it is so general that it must accompany any sketch, square or not. But first of all, we have to ask what kind of square is at stake here. This is a modest square sketched by Louis Kahn. The square, as interpreted by Kant, that is to say the square of a geometrician, is a general concept which may be drawn by him. In that situation, Kant uses the term construction, which he defines as the presentation of the intuition corresponding to the concept. But although, according to Kant, we must already admit the difference between the square in general and its drawing by the geometrician, there is a second and much more important difference which distinguishes the square of an architect from that of the geometrician. The square of the architect is implicitly or explicitly the presentation of a square which will be given measures in real space, that is to say, the measures of the building itself at the end of the design process. In other words, the architect's square will have to be linked in his mind with a general rule which architects usually call scale. So it is impossible to ignore the function of the square, which is to serve as a support to the general link through which the mental space of the architect is related to real space. In a way, the shape of this figure could be secondary with respect to its function. When Kahn will draw the square he is speaking about, and I insist on the future, to which I will come back later, he will be able to do so only inasmuch as he will associate to that square a represented measure of real space through a given scale, or rather through a chosen scale. We can simplify this by saying that Kant's square associates a geometrical shape and a scale in this diagram. Shape and a scale. One can then consider that the function of this square is to confer a space of measure for design. The shape as such is a singular shape. It could be a triangle. But the scale is a necessary function which accompanies the square. What is general in the fact that Kant says that he always starts with a square is the ability of that square to provide a space of representation within which he will be able to play the game of conception, that is, to design the building. To use a metaphor here, I would compare the square to the chessboard used by chess players. Such an interpretation of the function of the square can be confirmed in three ways. First, Kant points out the importance of the specificity of the architect's drawing versus the painter's drawing. I quote him, "The painter can make doorways smaller than people. He can make skies black in the daytime. He can make birds that can't fly because he is a painter. An architect must use round wheels, and he must make his doorways bigger than people." Second, we find him mentioning the phrase when measure enters into play as a specific moment in the design process. I quote him, "A great building, in my opinion," says he, "must begin with the unmeasurable, must go through measurable means when it is being designed, and in the end must be unmeasurable. Architecture is the embodiment of the unmeasurable." And third, he insists on the difference between drawing and design. In a well-known sketch for the Unitarian Church in Rochester, we find these words, "drawing, not a design." This is the sketch, but on the shameful Let me quote him about this schema. I made a square center in which I placed a question mark. Let us say I meant it to be the sanctuary. This I encircled with an ambulatory for these who did not want to go in the sanctuary. Around the ambulatory, I drew a corridor which belonged to an outer circle enclosing a space, the school. It was clear that school, which gives rise to question, became the wall which surrounds the question. And this was the form expression of the church, not the design. So he distinguishes form, which in his view is a form of an institution like school, and a building's shape. So between form and building, there is an obligatory phase in which the project has to go through measure. The distinction between drawing and design, which he points out, is related to the distinction which I try to express between the geometrician's square and the architect's one. To draw a square versus to design a square, or to draw a form versus to design a shape. Between the square of this sketch of the Unitarian church, which is a drawing of a form, and the actual square shape of any building whatsoever, there lies that very difference based on the necessary function of measure, which I mentioned, passing from form to shape, from drawing to design, from immeasurable to measurable. Here lies the general function of Kant's square, which is expressed by the word always of his statement. The square renders such a function manifest. To resume this analysis of the square, I would show this transparent. This is not a sketch. It's not a pipe either. And we can see here the concept of square of the geometrician, the square in general, the square constructed by the geometrician in the terms of Kant's construction. Kant's general square, as he's speaking about, and square with measure, and these three square, form plus measure is giving sketch. And then you have the square of the projected building or the square building. Back to intuition. I would like to move on to my conclusion through some remarks again dealing with intuition. If my thesis about the general function of linking mental space to real space in the architect's work understood as a general competence of the architect is right, I would call such a function intuition. We have seen that for Kant, intuition is immediacy of sensitivity. It is singular by definition. Whereas for Descartes, intuition is generalization by definition. Both Descartes and Kant were thinking in respect of the geometry of their time, the geometry they were contemporaries of. In a way, intuition viewed as a link of geometrical space to real space, whether going from singular to general or from general to singular, ceased to be a part of geometry since the latter developed through analytic rather than intuitive ways. This is probably a very sketchy history of geometry, but we know that since the emergence of new geometries, not a single one of them detains truth, and we can only say with Henri Poincaré that one or another is more or less convenient. But the architect, who is not concerned with producing theorems of geometry, but rather buildings, has still to deal with an intuition of space. Scale is the function through which the architect aims at space through sketches. This function is general and as such it is independent of the singular aspect of a given sketch, but Kant's square concretizes this general function through the general process of a square which comes into being in a given square. This general square, I mean the square Kahn is speaking about before drawing it, is a general idea which takes place before the designing of the square and even before the drawing. I would even, if we follow the Kahnian difference between drawing and design. In the same way, any architect making a sketch has to take a mental position in space before his pencil touches the paper. The function of intuitioning space, see here, function of intuitioning space, which is concretized by Kant's square, has to be understood as a general function which is in action in any sketch. This function presupposes that architect, before sketching, has to install himself in space through intuition. It is why I use here the term pre-sketch, which corresponds to an a priori intuition. This drawing by Kahn of Le Corbusier's Ronchamp Chapel shows how he installed himself so that he found a square in Ronchamp, which is curious. The above, this before sketching, which is the very object of Kant's sentence, is precisely what we should try to be aware of when examining sketches. This a priori position has, as I see it, something to do with Kant's main view concerning space as pure intuition, as a priori intuition, even if the emergence of different geometries makes such a notion of a priori intuition somewhat obsolete for some authors in the domain of philosophy of mathematics. I shall not try to be more precise on that as a conclusion. One knows that one finds in Kant, beside the so-called empirical intuition in this sense of immediate sensitivity to objects, what he calls pure intuition, which is an a priori intuition. One knows also that there were numerous criticisms made of Critique of Pure Reason when it was published for the first time, criticisms underlining the paradox between empirical intuition and pure, that is, a priori intuition. The paradox would be that intuition occurs only to the extent that the object itself does exist, as opposed to the fact that in the case of a priori intuition, there is not any given object. Kant says, right, intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. But we can think that there is no longer a paradox if we admit that first, objects in conception are by definition not given. They do not depend on empirical intuition. And that, second, they cannot be concepts either in the Kantian meaning of this term. Kant's square is not a concept of the square, as we saw. It is not an existing object of empirical intuition either. It can only be object of a priori intuition, as Kant puts it, that is, space as a priori intuition. But once again, the intuition I am speaking is concerned with a design theory, an architecturology, not with a theory of knowledge. Though possibly geometry got rid of intuition, the latter did not abandon architecture, and sketches give testimony to it in a general manner beyond the singularity of each of these sketches.